Thank you for that. Thank you for those songs, two of my favorites. I haven't sang that second one in a long time. I can remember that song growing up and my mom singing that echo part. And every time we sing that song, which is not very often in Kentucky, maybe it hasn't made its way out that far east yet. If you want to turn over to Matthew chapter 4 is where we will start this evening as we continue, as we continue in our study about how to go beyond the walls and what our responsibility is to go beyond the walls. Remember last night we talked about how we are obligated, how we should be eager, and how we should be unashamed from Romans chapter 1 about who we are as Christians and the message we have to bring. I love to fish, not as much as I love to hunt and maybe do some other things, but I enjoy fishing. Fishing is one of those things that fills in the gaps of my other hobbies because I can do it all year. And it's interesting for me growing up in California, then moving to Wyoming, and then now in Kentucky, I have had an opportunity to fish for all kinds of different things. Growing up in California, I loved fishing in the ocean. Whether it was going out on a deep sea type boat or fishing off the pier or in one of the bays. Ocean fishing is so much fun because you never know what you're going to reel in. You could throw, a piece of a sardine out on a hook and you could get a bite, and it could be anything from a shark. I've caught starfish to crab to flounder to halibut to sea bass and you don't never know until it's like right there and you're like, wow, I just caught this. Sometimes it creates a problem because some of the fish you catch in the ocean can be very dangerous to get the hook out of. So there are times where you just cut the line and let the fish go back with the hook and the bait and everything because you're not going to touch it. But then moving to Wyoming, when you go from fishing in the ocean to fishing in Wyoming, it's a completely different animal. I quickly fell in love with fishing in Wyoming. Probably some of my best memories, even though I've killed just about all the big game animals they have in Wyoming, some of my best outdoor experiences were fly fishing in the Wind River Mountains. I had the opportunity to catch golden trout up in the Wind River at Atlantic Creek. And that was something for me that I will always remember. It was incredible. Then moving to Kentucky and some of the best bass fishing out in the South. And each time you have different setups. This one, I have this one here. A little bit ago, I was outside and Dad goes, hey, if you're going to go fishing, use this rig, put a worm on it, and you're guaranteed to catch something. Now, isn't that what we all want when we go fishing, right? We want the guarantee to catch something, right? And that's where I take my kids out and I go take them to little lakes and I can put a worm on a hook and guarantee them to catch a bluegill. They're annoying and they're all over the place. But see, to me, a guarantee is nice when I fish, but I like the sport of it. So really, this is what I really like. I learned to love fly fishing in Wyoming. And I learned to love the idea of fly fishing and finding the dry fly versus the wet fly and what was hitting and what the hatch was and mimicking the hatch with the fly I used. And I'll never forget puddle jumping up the Wind River and the Poposia River up in Sinks Canyon. And you're trying to fly fish as a new fisher and you're trying to figure out how in the world am I going to flip a fly in a puddle the size of this pulpit. And you learn, and there was a lot of frustration. Because every time I'd go back, I'd get caught in something. And I spent most of my first times fly fishing digging the hook out of something, sometimes even me. But man, I remember one day a friend of ours from the church took me up to Atlantic Creek. It was in the wilderness in the Wind River Mountain Range, and we were going to go fishing for golden trout. And I will tell you, that is probably the most beautiful place I've ever been. It was August and there was still snow. That's how high we were. And these mountain flowers, we were way above the tree line, so there wasn't any trees. But these mountain flowers, and he told me, he says, okay, now when you dress, you want to dress in all neutral colors. And I'm thinking, I'm just going fishing. Because the fish up there, some of them had never seen people. And we'd crawl up on all fours to this puddle, and we'd kind of sneak up above the tall grass and flip our fly rods in these little ponds, and you're catching these beautiful golden trout. It was incredible. But because the trout were so finicky, you just couldn't catch them with any setup. I could not take this rig to that little pond and catch a golden trout. The hook's way too big. The line's way too strong. The sinker is way too big. And the splash that this sinker would make in that water would scare the fish probably a mile up and a mile down in that little river. So you understand, and all of us can comprehend the idea of wanting to make sure we have the right setup. If you notice, the title of the lesson tonight was Hook, Line, and Sinker. Does anybody know what that means? And it's interesting when you think about what it really means. Literally, if somebody were to take something hook, line, and sinker, they have been duped. They have been deceived. And unfortunately, that is what's happening in our world. People are taking people's words as gospel, and they're being deceived. They're taking falsehoods, hook, line, and sinker. And churches were popping up, and they're continuing to pop up all over the place. We have a church that's not far from us, right on the highway. We drive by it every day. I won't say the name of it, but it's a congregation that believes in the miraculous healing. And they do these miraculous healings, and they have this idea of this false indwelling of the Holy Spirit and how the Holy Spirit miraculously works to miraculously heal people. And this little congregation every Sunday and every Wednesday is bursting at its seams. And they're teaching falsehoods. It's interesting though, and I still haven't figured it out. One day I will stop. They have meetings every once in a while, healing meetings, and I want to go to one because I have a bad knee. So I would like it healed. But it's interesting to me, this congregation of people who believe in this miraculous healing of the Holy Spirit, that I could come lay my hand on Roger's head and heal him of any ailment he has. This congregation has 4 handicap parking spots out front. Why? For visitors? I don't know why. But you see, people have been duped, and they have taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker, not truth, but some man's idea. Some idea that has been whittled into their brain that sounds good, whether it's picking up a tradition from their parents or their grandparents, whether it sounds good at the time. You can go on TV and watch these televangelists, and it's crazy what they teach, and people believe it. They take the bait, hook, line, and sinker. But you see, we don't need to present something deceitfully to somebody because the truth we have is good enough bait. You see, if I have the right rig, whether I'm going fly fishing or I'm going to go fish something with a worm in the Salmon River out here, if I have the right rig, I can catch the fish. I can hook the fish, I can reel the fish in. Sometimes I think we try to manipulate, or the world maybe, tries to manipulate the message in which we're trying to give out. Do you realize the truth of the gospel is good enough in itself? Right? The truth of the gospel is good enough in itself. That is the best bait, the best rig, the best line, the best hook. That's the best of everything if we're going to be fishers of men. So I drew your attention to Matthew chapter 4. And Christ calls his first disciples. After he was tempted up on the mountain, he comes down out of that mountain, and he says in verse 18, he says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Notice their actions. Immediately. I love that word. The ESV uses that word immediately. This is their profession. This is what they did for a living. This is maybe all they knew. It says immediately they left their nets and followed him. Why? Because Christ was going to make them fishers of men. He took two men at this point that were professional fishermen. That's what they did for a living. That's how they made their living. And he said, "I'm going to take you and I'm going to make you fish for men." And that is our responsibility, each of us. That's the idea of going beyond the walls. That's the concept of saying, I have a responsibility. We all know what responsibilities are. We have responsibilities to our families. We have responsibilities to the bankers. We have responsibilities to our neighbors. We have responsibilities to our communities. We understand what responsibilities are. We have a responsibility to mankind. All of us in this room have a responsibility to mankind. And like we talked about last night, Paul understood, I believe, better than anyone else besides Christ in the New Testament, his responsibility to mankind. It was his life. He was dedicated to it. Dedicated so much to the point where he didn't get married. Dedicated to the point where so much that he was willing to do whatever it took. And I will correct myself from last night. I gave you a wrong scripture reference. I used 2 Corinthians chapter 13 to define what Paul went through in his shipwreck and his near-death experience. That is actually 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So you can go back and mark that off and change the reference. But that was Paul's life. That's what he devoted all of himself to. So do you think Paul would have said, you know what, I need to really catch some men for Christ. I need to lead souls to Christ. So I'm just going to pick up any rig and run with it. How foolish would it be if you had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to hike up to the Wind River Mountains and to Atlantic Creek and catch golden trout? Okay, that's a bucket list item for a lot of people. Okay, so you got an opportunity to do this, and maybe it's on your bucket list to do this, and you were told, hey, you need this type of fly rod, you need this weight of line, you need this fly. How many of us would say, I'll just take what I got, bring me some worms? How many of us would do that? Nobody. Nobody in our right mind would say, well, I'll just take what I have. Because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to bring the right equipment to catch the fish that we're so longing to catch. Unfortunately, sometimes we treat our evangelism that way. We treat our evangelism with an idea of haphazard action. Well, if this works, it works. If not, oh well. Instead of saying, I'm going to study how to make it work effectively. So I want to draw your attention to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We will spend all of our remaining time, and I owe you a couple minutes from last night, so I'll try to go through it quicker this evening. But if 2 Corinthians chapter 5 is where we're going to start. And in verse 11, Paul begins speaking about this ministry of reconciliation. Literally, Paul is explaining the idea of this ministry that Paul has to reconcile the lost back to God. Okay, so the idea is, as Paul says, I understand my responsibility. I understand my responsibility is to take people who are no longer in a right relationship with God, whether they're Jew or Gentile or barbarian or slave or free or male or female, whoever they are, whoever the lost souls are, Paul says, I have a responsibility to reconcile them, to give them the truth, to reconcile them back to God. So look what he says starting in verse 16. He says, from now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though once we regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. He says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. In verse 19, he defines it. This is one of those underlining verses, highlighted verses, put a star next to it verses, because he tells us what that ministry is. He says that is, in verse 19, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses or their sins against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. So what was God doing through Christ? Through Christ, God brought sinners back to God. Isn't that our responsibility? Isn't that our responsibility to realize what God has done? And it's our responsibility to bring the message to them, to bring lost souls back to God. That's what he says he does. Therefore, he says in verse 20, we are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. God gave his son for sinners. God gave his son for you. God gave his son for me. We understand if you go back to Romans chapter 3. In verse 23, he tells us what? For all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Therefore what? That creates a problem in my life. See, if I have sin, if I am included in that all, which we all are, have sin, that means all of us need Christ. That means all of the world needs Christ. That means our relatives need Christ. That means the good people in this world need Christ. That means our enemies need Christ. That means those who we don't see eye to eye with sometimes need Christ. That means those who have different personalities than we do need Christ. That means those who may fly a flag differently than the flag we fly needs Christ. That means those who maybe vote differently than we do need Christ. But unfortunately, sometimes we are really good at bringing the gospel to those who are like us. Those who have the same amount of money in their bank account as us. Those who drive the same type of vehicles as us. Those who live in the same part of town as us. Those who vote the same as us. Those who have the same political views as us. Those who carry a gun like we do. That's the people we want to talk to. But Christ sat with the woman at the well who was completely not like him. Paul went into the lion's den, if you will, to people who wanted to do nothing more than kill him. I look at our life and I say, listen, if we are going to bring the right rig, if we're going to focus our time, we have a great responsibility to figure out how best we can bring the truth of salvation to people. Therefore, I want to propose to you several ideas this evening. Number one, we can win souls when we are ambassadors for Christ. You know what an ambassador means? Paul says in that verse in chapter 5 and verse 20, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us. An ambassador is somebody who represents something. So that's an interesting idea. I can win souls. And later on, as we get into chapter 6, we're going to see Paul is effective at winning souls because of how he rigs the pole, if you will. He says first, though, he says, I'm an ambassador for Christ. I am a representative for Christ. So when we understand we're representatives for Christ, who are we not representatives for? Ourself. Satan. And I was thinking, if I evaluated my life, as I walk through my life, as I shop at the grocery store, as I get gas station, as I drive down the highway, as I interact with people on a daily basis, am I representing Christ in my everyday actions? Am I representing Christ in the way I talk? Am I representing Christ in the way I parent? Am I representing Christ in the way I am to my wife? What does the community around me see? You know, when somebody cuts me off on the main road, am I representing Christ in what I say or what I yell? It's amazing how many times people see what we do. Maybe amazing is not the right word. Maybe scary is more of an appropriate word. As my kids have gotten older, they'll say something like, "Where did you hear that?" "You." Am I representing Christ in the things that I say in my home where I think nobody else can hear except my children? Am I representing Christ when I drive home on Sunday morning? This is not an original point to me, but I think it's effective. What do we say about services on the way home from Sunday morning that the other people in the car can hear? Well, I wish that song leader led that song a little faster. Man, it was so boring this morning. The preacher just got up and just, Well, we probably could have missed that one. And I know sometimes we just say things, but it's amazing what people hear. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 16, and in chapter 11 and verse 1, Paul makes a statement. And I believe it echoes this idea of being an ambassador, a representative for Christ. He says, "Therefore be imitators of me as I am of Christ." See, if I'm going to be a representative for Christ, an ambassador, if I'm going to spend the time to rig the pole exactly how the pole needs to be rigged so I can be most effective at catching men, I need to first understand that I am a representative, I am an ambassador of Christ. And people are watching, and you better believe people are watching. And they really start watching closely as soon as they find out who you are as a Christian, or as soon as you begin professing Christianity. How many times do they watch Christ just to do what? Trip them up. You imagine when Christ on the Sabbath was going through the wheat field and he was pulling the wheat to eat it, and they were watching. Can you imagine him? Look, he's working. We got him. They do that to us. You know that. How many times have you heard statements like this? "I can't believe you said that. I thought you said you were a Christian." "Yeah, but I'm also human. I also make mistakes." But you see, an ambassador of Christ is willing to admit the mistake. An ambassador of Christ is willing to be corrected with the mistake. We are ambassadors of Christ when we imitate Christ. When we are ambassadors of Christ, that looks like being with people. And we're going to talk about that a little more in a minute. That looks like having a selfless love for people. And I think maybe one of the most important points on the idea of imitating Christ is being under the Father's authority. Understanding that I'm not the authority. Understanding that the preacher is not the authority, that the elder is not the authority, that there is no creed that is the authority, but the Father is the authority. In John 8:28, Christ says, "I do nothing of my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me." That's being an ambassador. I don't do anything on Dustin's accord, but everything I do is coming from the Father. That's being an ambassador. You see, when I can live my life that way, I can win souls because I will be different than the world, and the world will see that. They saw Christ was different. If you ever go back to the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, Christ gets done preaching this miraculous sermon. And they were in awe. Literally because he was different in the way he spoke. And the people who heard him noticed he was different. That's why the Pharisees and the Sadducees were scared of him, because he was different. They didn't want their authority taken away. They didn't want the people who followed them following him. People will notice. We are ambassadors for Christ first and foremost when we meet people where they are. Listen, we have to learn to be in our communities. I don't know what that looks like for you. Because you see, just as this rig right here is effective at a certain place in a certain time, that rig is effective at a certain place in a certain time. Sometimes we look at evangelism as a cookie cutter thing. It's not cookie cutter. It's maybe something we've looked at that we're traditionally caught in. Right? The church wants to traditionally evangelize this way. Let's go knock doors. And everybody wears a suit and tie while we knock doors. Guess what? It's 2023. That's not going to be the right rig on that pole. But you know what is? I spend a lot of time at the high school speaking for Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I go and speak to the baseball team. I'm going into a public school, and I get to open my Bible speaking about God. I do work for CASA. It's a court-appointed advocate service. So kids who are in foster care, and maybe kids who are going in and out of the system, they can't appear in family court if they're under 18. So what do? I go in and I meet the kid, and I represent the kid. And I go to court for the kid. And before long, people are going, why are you doing that? Not because of me, but because I am an ambassador for Christ, and that's what he'd do. Remember, he said what? Let the children come to me. Okay, we can be ambassadors for Christ. Man, go be part of a club in town. I was part of Kiwanis for a long time in Lander because it got me in the community. It got me around other people. And when I'm around other people, I can be part of other people. See, how effective can we be if we don't do anything in the community except our job, and we come here on Sunday morning and we never go beyond the walls to be ambassadors for Christ? There's all kinds of opportunities that we can go into the community and meet people where they at. Not only physically, but we can meet people where they are emotionally. Listen, we don't know everybody's story. And sometimes we assume we know their story. Sometimes we assume we know who they are. We don't know their story. And sometimes because we assume we know who they are, we don't give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes. Sometimes we assume everybody's like we are. Everybody had the same experience as we do. Everybody had the same upbringing we had. But that's not the case. I think of John chapter 4 with the woman at the well. It's a great example of this. Because the Samaritan woman would have been completely different than a Jewish man that Christ was. In fact, a Jewish person was not supposed to even talk to a Samaritan woman. Especially this Samaritan woman who was downtrodden even in her community, that she would come in the middle of the day. Do you know why she came in the middle of the day? Because she wanted to go when no one else was around, because she was looked down upon by everybody, even in her own community. Did Christ look down on her? Did Christ tell her her life was okay? No. But Christ talked to her. Christ loved her. Christ gave her the living water. Christ spoke to her in a way that she goes back to her community and says, you need to come see this guy because he's the Christ. He's the one we've been waiting for. When we're ambassadors for Christ, we can meet people where they are emotionally and physically. When we are ambassadors for Christ, we extend the same grace, love, and mercy that has been extended to us. I don't know what the lady's story is walking down the street. I don't know what the drunkard story is. I've had young people sit in my office. Several young ladies came in one day when I was in Lander off the reservation. And I don't know how the reservations are around here, but in Wyoming, the Shoshone and the Arapaho, who really border Lander, are pretty rough. To the point rough that an ambulance will not go onto the reservation without a police escort after dark rough. I had two young girls come into my office one day and they needed help. And when they came into my office, they were already high as a kite. In that moment, I had a choice, didn't I? I had a choice to say, or I had a choice to do what? Hey, Amanda, I need you to come down here because I have two young ladies and we need to talk to them. We need to help them. And call one of the elders and him's wife to come down. We have this two young ladies and we have to help them. I don't know their story. I don't know what was happening in their home life. I don't know if they were beaten. I don't know if they were sexually raped. I don't know any of that. It's not my responsibility to know their whole story. My responsibility is to do what? To be an ambassador of Christ and to bring them the gospel in every way I can. And that time that was through my actions. I have to become an ambassador for Christ. If I want to win souls, I have to be like Paul and be a representative of Christ. I need to be able to confidently say what Paul said. Therefore, imitate me as I imitate Christ. When I can make that statement in my everyday walk, in my everyday actions, I will be effective at fishing for men. As we continue down to the text in chapter 6, he says in verse 1, working together with him, then we appeal to you, not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in a favorable time I listened to you, in a day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. We put no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. The second idea I want to look at is this. We can win souls when we don't become an obstacle for people. You think about that idea. What becomes an obstacle for people? Do you think sometimes, and I can answer this for myself, do you think sometimes we become an obstacle for people because we try to say things, but our life does not reflect the things we try to say? Maybe I am the person who goes and invites somebody to church, asking them to come and study the Bible with me. And I have a Jesus sticker on the back of my car, and I'm the same person yelling profanities at this person who cut me off on Main Street. Maybe I am the person inviting them to church, trying to get them to come to church, and they don't see godly living in me. They see me mistreating my wife. They see me mistreating my community. Maybe I'm the person who invites people to church and tries to get them to study the Bible. I proclaim Christ and I try to be that way, but my business affairs aren't kept as they should be. I become somebody in the community that has a reputation of not returning borrowed goods or stealing or being dishonest. See, sometimes we place obstacles in our way to be effective at being fishers of men. And that's what Paul is so worried about. He says, we put no obstacle, verse 3 of chapter 6, we put no obstacle in anyone's way so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But if servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way by great endurance, in afflictions, in hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, and hunger. If you think of that idea, the list he just gave, Paul says literally, in life, through all the valleys that you may go through, I want to make sure that I don't put an obstacle in your way. What does that obstacle look like? Maybe that obstacle looks like something like this. I'm just having a bad day, and something comes out of your mouth that's impure. Maybe that obstacle is like, man, Dustin said he goes to church all the time, but man, the jokes he tells, oof, kind of off color. Man, Dustin said he goes to church all the time, and man, he just posted this devotional on Facebook, and the very next post has profanity in it. You see the confusion that creates? People look at it and they go, wow, I'm not sure what to believe. Who is this person really? Paul says in all of these calamities, these sleepless nights, these beatings, these imprisonments, what has he tried to maintain? Look at verse 6. By purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, the Holy Spirit, genuine love, that's that agape love, that selfless love, by truthful speech and the power of God. No, not even am I putting an obstacle in somebody's way, but I'm really removing myself from the equation. Because not only we can win souls when we don't put an obstacle in people's way, but I can win souls when I realize it's God's power that causes the growth. Right? Isn't that what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3? That he said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Sometimes I think we're too full of ourselves. And I think sometimes when we think we're too full of ourselves, we get down on ourselves when the plant doesn't grow as fast as we want it to. Man, I've been trying, and I've been calling, and I've been inviting, and I've had 3 different Bible studies with this person, and they're still not getting it. I guess I just need to go back to what Christ told the disciples, to dust the dirt off my feet and move on. Well, that's not exactly what he said. Because sometimes it takes a long time for the plant to grow. And God will give the growth. It's amazing. There's been several times in my ministry, in my life, where I have studied with somebody and it never seems to go anywhere. 3-4 years later, I get a phone call. Hey, guess what? I was just baptized. All because a seed was planted a long time ago. And maybe the seed was planted in something that was said. Maybe the seed was planted in an action that we took. But you see, we can win souls when I realize God is the one who gives the growth. See, Salmon, this church here, this body of people is just a tool for God. You all are planters. You all are planters. I remember the story of Johnny Appleseed. And I remember this little cartoon of him like skipping across, and he'd like kick up the dirt with his heel, and he'd drop the seed, and he'd cover it up with his foot, and he'd go back and kick the dirt up his heel and drop the seed. And that's who we are. We're just planters. Some of us are planters, then some of us may come behind, and some of us may water. But according to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we all have these important roles to play in the body. He tells us that we're all individual members of one body. We're not all eyes, and we're not all ears, and we're not all hands, and we're not all feet. But we each play a role. But I think sometimes, and I know personally for me, sometimes I place so much of the emphasis on me that I get stressed out that no plants are growing. And I need to take a step back and say, Dustin, your responsibility is to plant the seed. Sometimes planting the seed looks like this way. This is something that Dan Owen has taught me. We all play a part. Some of us are bringers. Bringers are a very effective tool in the church. You may not be able to sit down and have a Bible study with somebody. Not everybody has that ability. Maybe you're a keeper. You know, sometimes we have bringers and we bring them to church and people start watering, but sometimes we need keepers. Those are the people that sometimes the water flows in and the back door is left wide open, and they come in and it goes right out as fast as they come in. We don't have any keepers. The keepers are like these type of people. Keepers are people who with the gift of hospitality. Keepers are people that have the opportunities to sit down and write letters to visitors. Keepers are people who say, hey, it's great to have you. Let's go grab coffee tomorrow morning. Keepers are usually people who are outgoing. They're willing to talk to a newcomer. Not everybody's a keeper, and that's okay. We don't all have to be keepers. That's the value of the body. That's the value of many individual members of one body. Sometimes you're a prayer. You're praying for seeds to grow. You're praying for bringers to bring. You're praying for keepers to keep. Prayers are the backbone of the congregation. They're the people who really desire growth of the kingdom. They're people who really understand the power of prayer. So maybe you're a bringer, you're a keeper, you're a prayer. Maybe you're an encourager. Not everybody's an encourager. But I will tell you as a young minister, encouragers are extremely valuable in the church because encouragement is a dying breed. People don't like encouraging like they used to because we become prideful. And if I tell you good job or if I tell you it's good to see you, somehow people think that I'm lesser than. But we need to be encouragers. You know, it's something very typical that we see in the foyer before we come in on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night. It's the handshake and the words that say, it's good to see you. Is it good to see you? Is it really? Or is it just something we say like this? How are you? How are you? What is your response? Great. And then what do we do after we do that? How are you?
Great.
Good. How are you? Fine. And that's what we do, right? That's pretty typical. But an encourager says, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Why are you great?
Because I'm saved. I'm doing better than I deserve.
I want to know more about why he's great. I want to know why she's just fine. I'm here. She should be great. In fact, she should be awesome, ecstatic. But that's what we do, right? But the encourager goes beyond that. You see, the encourager wants to know why he's great. Because they want to share in the greatness. They want to share in that moment. The encourager wants to know why they're having a bad day. Because the encourager may sometimes become the prayer. And they're going to pray with that person right now to encourage them. See, when I recognize God's in control and God's doing the work, I then can recognize my part in the role, in the play, in the overall scheme of everything. Because you see, I can rig the pole and I can think I do the best I can and I can get the right test of line and I can have the right size hook and I can have the right bait. But the fish still has to bite it. I can have everything right. I can have the smile. I can have the prayer. I can have the friendly handshake. I can be the example in the community. But the power is still and always will be in God. And Paul recognizes that. Look at what he says. He says in verse 7, by truthful speech and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left. Through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise, we are treated as impostors, and yet we are true. The last concept I want to give you, it's a short one, but I think it's important. We can win souls, and I want this to stick. If you don't remember anything else I say, please remember this one. We can win souls when we are real. I think so many times we're so phony in our religious walk. I don't know why. I don't know why it's become a thing. And maybe that's something that I have seen in my life. We just need to learn to be real with people. It's okay if we mess up. And you know what else? It's okay to recognize we messed up. In Romans chapter 7 and verse 15, Paul says, as he's explaining his struggle with the flesh, he says, I do the very things I hate. Paul was real with the people he spoke to. Paul realized he had his own shortcomings. And I think sometimes we're not real with people. See, what was happening in Corinth was there were imposters coming in claiming to be Paul and some of the other apostles. And they were claiming to come in and they said, we're preaching Christ, but they would preach a false gospel. But Paul says, we have come in and we are not the imposters, but we are true. We are the real deal. You in this room, us in this room, we are the real deal. We have the truth of the gospel. We have the right rig. We don't need a hook, line, and sinker that deceives somebody. Because we have the right setup in God. We have the truth. The truth that says God sent his son to save the sinner. That God sent his son to take away man's greatest problem. I just need to somehow get out of his way and allow him work in my life. Allow him to do what he needs to do through me and not be fake with people. To be real with people. To just be a normal person that's struggling through this life like everybody else is struggling. Because as soon as we get on our high horse, and as soon as the church becomes a museum of saints instead of a hospital for sinners, that's when the church becomes less effective. That's when the church becomes somebody that's set up on a hill and nobody thinks they're worthy enough to go into. And maybe we don't think that still happens, but you've all heard something to the effect of this. I can't believe I stepped in a church building and the lightning bolt didn't strike me dead. Because that is a reputation, unfortunately, that the church has. That it's just a bunch of holy people and I'm not welcome there. Well, when we can learn to be honest, to be real, I don't have to worry about the hook, line, and sinker that everybody gives. I have this little thing that I made up, and I have this hook somewhere. I have a line, and I have my hook, and I have my sinker. Okay, everybody knows, you've all seen this before. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in this world that have chosen to take this bait without asking why. They're willing to bite the hook. They're willing to have it into their lip and be dragged around based on man's decisions, based on man's ideas, based on false teachings, based on whatever else the world seems to come up with. We don't have to do that, guys. We don't have to come up with gimmicks. The church doesn't need to come up with gimmicks because the church has the truth. They don't need a fancy hook. They don't need a fancy building, fancy pews. Those are all great to have. They're blessings. Because the real deal is the rig that God has given us that's ready to catch the golden trout in the top of the Wind River Mountain Range or a fish out of the Salmon River. And it's already been given. And it's all contained between my two leather covers. I don't need a hook, line, and sinker. I've been given the proper setup. We've been given the proper setup. There may be some here tonight that maybe has taken the bait, the hook, line, and sinker. The deceit has been given, and maybe there are questions you have about why does the church do this, or maybe you don't do this. Whatever your need may be tonight, the invitation's always open. It's always you're always invited by God as we strive to win souls and not give the hook, line, and sinker. If there's anybody here who needs to respond to the invitation, now is the time. While together we stand and while we sing the song that's been selected.